Picture this: a figure wrapped in linen, lying undisturbed for thousands of years, its features frozen in time. This isn't just a relic of the past. It's a silent witness to one of humanity's most fascinating secrets. What if I told you that the art of embalming wasn't just about preserving the dead? Behind those ancient bandages lies a story of power, control, and a hidden chemistry that shaped empires. The Egyptians didn't just mummify bodies, they perfected a science so potent, it became a tool of dominance, wielded by priests and pharaohs to command reverence and fear. Think about it. These embalming recipes weren't scribbled on scraps of papyrus for everyone to see. They were guarded like state secrets, passed down through generations of elite practitioners. Why? Because the ability to cheat decay wasn't just a technical marvel, it was a symbol of divine authority. Those who held the knowledge of preservation held the keys to the afterlife, and with it, the loyalty of the living. The ingredients themselves were more than just spices and resins. They were carefully chosen to send a message. Every drop of cedar oil, every handful of natron, whispered the same truth. This is the power of the gods, and it belongs to us. But here's the twist. The real magic wasn't in the materials alone. It was in the way they were used to manipulate perception, to create awe, to solidify hierarchies. The embalmers weren't just chemists, they were master storytellers, crafting a narrative of eternal life that kept the masses obedient and the rulers unchallenged. Today, we're going to peel back those layers not just of linen, but of history itself, to uncover how these ancient recipes were weapons of influence. How did a blend of salt and herbs become a tool of control? What hidden messages are encoded in the very substances that touch these bodies? The answers will take us deep into the heart of a civilization where science and power were inseparable, and where the dead still speak, if we know how to listen. Long before the pyramids pierced the horizon, before golden masks adorned royal faces, the first experiments with eternity began in the scorching sands of Egypt. Around 2600 BC, the earliest embalmers discovered something extraordinary the desert itself could preserve. When bodies were buried in shallow graves, the dry heat and alkaline sand acted like a natural dehydrator, slowing decay. But this was just the beginning. As Egyptian society grew more complex, so did their methods. The Nile provided the key ingredient natron, a salty mineral harvested from its banks. This wasn't just table salt, it was a desiccant so powerful it could pull moisture from flesh, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell ready for the next life. What started as a practical solution became something far more profound. Over centuries, priests and chemists refined the process, layering rituals with science. They learned that removing organs slowed decomposition, that resin-coated bandages repelled insects, that certain herbs masked the scent of death. But here's the fascinating part. These weren't random experiments. Each step was a calculated move, elevating embalming from craft to sacred art. The pharaohs didn't just want preservation, they wanted perfection. A well-preserved body wasn't merely a corpse, it was proof of divine favor, a physical anchor for the soul's journey. And that's where power entered the equation. Control the recipe, and you control the narrative. The priesthood guarded these techniques closely, turning embalming into a spectacle of exclusivity. Imagine the message sent when only royalty and elites could afford the finest treatments, natron from specific quarries, imported myrrh, linen woven by temple weavers. The chemicals didn't just preserve flesh, they preserved hierarchy. Every wrapped limb, every amulet tucked between layers whispered the same truth: immortality wasn't for everyone. It was a privilege doled out by those who held the secrets, but the real genius lay in the illusion. By framing embalming as a divine gift, the ruling class made science sacred. The tools were mundane: salt, cloth, knives, but the meaning was monumental. A pharaoh's mummy wasn't just a body, it was a political statement, a reminder that even in death their authority endured. And so, what began as a way to honor the dead became one of history's most enduring tools of control. The next time you see a mummy, look beyond the wrappings. What you're really seeing is the birth of a system where chemistry and power were forever intertwined. The priesthood didn't just perform embalming rituals, they orchestrated them like sacred theater. Picture this: a dimly lit chamber, heavy with the scent of cedar and myrrh, where masked priests moved in silence, chanting words so potent they were believed to animate the very chemicals they used. These weren't mere technicians, they were gatekeepers of the afterlife, wielding recipes like spells. Ancient texts like the Book of the Dead reveal just how tightly they guarded their knowledge. One passage warns, "The uninitiated who speaks these words will perish, his tongue cut out, his name erased." This wasn't hyperbole. The penalties for leaking embalming secrets ranged from exile to execution, ensuring that only the priesthood could mediate between mortals and the divine. And what a mediation it was! Every step of the process dripped with symbolism. When a priest removed the brain through the nose with a hooked tool, it wasn't just practical, it was a ritual act, severing earthly thoughts to prepare for celestial wisdom. The washing of the body with palm wine wasn't merely antiseptic, it mirrored the flooding of the Nile, a rebirth in miniature. Even the 70-day timeline for mummification wasn't arbitrary. It mirrored the journey of the star Sirius, whose disappearance and return marked the Egyptian calendar. These weren't just techniques, they were narratives woven into flesh, reinforcing the priesthood's role as the sole interpreters of cosmic order. The genius of this system, it made the chemical inseparable from the spiritual. A commoner might see natron as simple salt, but the priests declared it the tears of the god Horus. Resin became the blood of sacred trees, linen bandages the wings of the goddess Isis. By infusing every ingredient with divine meaning, they transformed a preservation process into a sacrament. And here's the masterstroke: this symbology wasn't just for the dead. Public processions showed priests carrying golden amulets and reciting incantations, reminding the living that their own eternity depended on priestly favor. A farmer tilling the fields knew his body would rot without their intercession, a powerful incentive to obey temple decrees. This monopoly granted priests staggering influence. They dictated who could be mummified, how elaborate the process would be, even where the body could rest. Wealthy families paid exorbitant fees for premium treatments. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a luxury funeral package. But the real power lay in subtler gestures. A priest might accidentally omit a protective amulet from a noble's wrappings, or hint that a merchant's shoddy embalming might doom his soul. These weren't just threats, they were psychological levers, ensuring that from marketplace to palace, no one dared challenge temple authority. Perhaps the most telling detail: the priesthood's own mummies were often the least preserved. While pharaohs got the full 70-day treatment, many high priests were buried with startling haste. Why? Because they understood the secret wasn't in the chemicals, it was in the belief. As long as people thought priests held the keys to eternity, the priests held the keys to power. That's the true alchemy here, turning fear of decay into a system of control so enduring, its echoes still whisper through the linen wrappings millennia later. Natron wasn't just a tool, it was the very foundation of the embalmer's art. This unassuming white powder, harvested from the dried lake beds along the Nile, possessed a chemistry so precise it could halt decay in its tracks. At its core, natron was a blend of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, with traces of salt and sulfate. These compounds worked in unison, drawing moisture from tissues while creating an alkaline environment hostile to bacteria. But the real marvel was its selectivity. Unlike modern desiccants that can leave remains brittle or distorted, natron preserved with remarkable gentleness, maintaining skin elasticity and facial features crucial for the soul's recognition in the afterlife. The sourcing of natron was no casual endeavor. The most prized deposits came from Wadi Natron, a valley northwest of Cairo whose name still echoes its ancient significance. Here, seasonal floods left behind crusts of the mineral, gleaming like frost under the desert sun. Harvesting it required precise timing, too early, and the natron would be diluted by lingering moisture. Too late, and scorching winds could scatter the deposits. This natural rhythm turned natron into a seasonal commodity, as coveted as gold. Caravans transported it in linen sacks stamped with royal seals, and temple records show it accounted for nearly a third of all state-sponsored trade missions during the New Kingdom. Control over these supply chains became a lever of power. Pharaohs designated natron as a divine substance, restricting its sale to licensed embalming workshops. Prices fluctuated based on purity grades, with the whitest, most crystalline batches reserved for royalty. Commoners often had to make do with a green natron, a lower-grade mix contaminated by algae, which sometimes left mummies discolored or prone to mold. The message was clear: even in death, social hierarchies persisted. A nobleman's family might pay the equivalent of a year's harvest for premium natron, while a farmer's remains might be packed with cheap substitutes like sand or sawdust. But the priesthood took this stratification further. They wove natron into their creation myths, claiming the god Osiris first used it to preserve his own dismembered body. Temple murals showed gods offering natron to pharaohs, framing its use as a divine endorsement. During embalming ceremonies, priests recited spells over natron-filled bowls, declaring, "You are the tears of Ra, the sweat of Anubis." This sacralization transformed a simple mineral into a spiritual currency, one that required temple approval to access. The economic implications were staggering. Natron taxes funded temple expansions and military campaigns. Records from Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders, reveal workers were sometimes paid in natron rations instead of grain. And when foreign powers like the Persians invaded Egypt, their first act was often to seize natron stockpiles, understanding that controlling this resource meant controlling the people's connection to eternity. Yet natron was just the beginning. The embalmer's toolkit included resins that doubled as political symbols, unguents that carried coded messages, even imported spices that traced Egypt's trade networks. Each ingredient held layers of meaning, but that's a revelation for another chapter. For now, consider this: in a civilization that measured time in dynasties, the true measure of power wasn't just land or armies. It was who held the salts that could cheat time itself. Imagine a substance so precious, traders braved scorching deserts and pirate-infested waters to bring it to Egypt. Myrrh and frankincense weren't just ingredients, they were the ultimate status symbols, dripping with political and spiritual significance. Harvested from gnarled trees in the distant lands of Punt and Arabia, these aromatic resins transformed the embalming process into a spectacle of wealth and power. When a pharaoh's body was anointed with frankincense, it wasn't just about preservation. It was a calculated display, a way to shout to the world, "Look how far my influence reaches." The logistics behind these imports were staggering. Myrrh traveled over 1,000 miles via camel caravans, its value increasing with every league. Ship manifests from the reign of Hatshep sought reveal that a single expedition to Punt could return with over 30 live myrrh trees planted in the courtyards of temples as living trophies. The message was unmistakable. Egypt's rulers didn't just acquire these substances, they commanded the very forces of nature to serve them, and the rarer the resin, the louder the statement. Royal embalmers used a variant called Ka myrrh, so exclusive it was reserved solely for pharaohs, its deep red hue symbolizing the blood of the sun god Ra. But this wasn't just about showing off. These resins played a cunning dual role. Frankincense, when burned to fumigate the body, released acids that slowed bacterial growth. Myrrh oil penetrated tissues like a natural antibiotic, delaying decay while perfuming the corpse with a scent associated with divinity. The priesthood spun this practicality into propaganda. If foreign resins could preserve flesh, surely they could bridge the gap between earthly and eternal realms. A nobleman's family might splurge on a few drops of imported resin for their loved one's burial, but pharaohs were embalmed with entire jars of the stuff, their bodies gleaming with sacred stickiness. Control over these trade routes became a geopolitical weapon. When the kingdom of Kush cut off myrrh shipments during a rebellion, Pharaoh Thutmose III didn't just send troops, he specifically targeted oasis towns along the caravan routes. Victory wasn't complete until the resin flowed again. Similarly, diplomatic gifts of frankincense were carefully measured. A lesser ally might receive a single block, a favored vassal king an entire chest. The resins even appear in peace treaties with clauses guaranteeing unceasing delivery of Punt's tears as tribute. The most revealing detail, counterfeit resins began appearing in tombs of the middle class. Archaeologists have found bundles of cheap pine resin wrapped to mimic myrrh, complete with forged seals from Punt. This black market trade proves how deeply the link between these substances and status had seeped into society. To be buried without them wasn't just a practical compromise, it was a social humiliation, an admission that one's family lacked connections to the halls of power. Yet beyond politics and prestige, these ingredients held a darker psychological power. The scent of myrrh in temple ceremonies wasn't merely pleasant, it triggered memory centers in the brain, creating visceral associations between the ruling class and the divine. When citizens caught whiffs of these aromas during public mummification displays, it wasn't just a smell they remembered. It was the intoxicating idea that immortality itself had a price tag, and their rulers held the receipt. The richest purple in the ancient world wasn't just a color, it was a calculated display of dominance. Tyrian purple, extracted from the glands of Mediterranean sea snails, became the ultimate status symbol, woven into the very bandages that swaddled royal mummies. Each drop of this dye told a story of conquest. It took 12,000 snails to produce just 1 gram of pigment, a staggering cost that made it worth 3 times its weight in gold. When a pharaoh's corpse was wrapped in these violet-stained linens, the message was unmistakable. This was no ordinary mortal, but a being touched by the gods themselves. But the symbolism ran deeper than mere extravagance. In Egyptian cosmology, purple straddled the boundary between red, the color of life and chaos, and blue, the hue of the divine and eternal. By draping themselves in this transitional shade, rulers visually asserted their role as bridges between earthly and celestial realms. Temple murals show Osiris clothed in purple, reinforcing the connection between the dye and divine authority. Even the process of creating Tyrian purple mirrored mummification. The snails were left to rot in salt before their precious secretions could be harvested, echoing the preservation of human remains. Controlling access to such colors became a ruthless exercise in power. The Phoenicians, who monopolized Tyrian purple production, guarded their coastal dye workshops with military precision. Egyptian merchants had to navigate a labyrinth of middlemen, tariffs, and royal decrees just to secure a single bolt of purple linen. Records from the reign of Ramses II reveal that unauthorized possession of Tyrian dyed fabric could result in forced labor in the turquoise mines of Sinai. The priesthood amplified this exclusivity by declaring the color sacred. Ordinary citizens caught wearing it risked not just punishment in this life, but damnation in the next. Other pigments carried similar weight. Ultramarine blue, ground from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, adorned the burial masks of queens to represent the night sky they would traverse in the afterlife. Green, made from malachite, symbolized rebirth and was reserved for the heart scarabs placed on mummies' chests. Even the humble yellow ochre used to paint tomb walls had strict hierarchies. The purest shades came from a single quarry near Thebes, its output rationed by temple scribes. The psychological impact of this color caste system was profound. Imagine a farmer seeing his pharaoh's mummy unveiled, a luminous figure swathed in hues he could never legally possess, the very air around it heavy with imported resins. Every glance reinforced the same lesson. Some souls were destined to fade into obscurity, while others would blaze across eternity in technicolor. Yet the most chilling detail lies in the archaeology. Recent scans of mid-ranking officials' mummies show something startling: traces of counterfeit dyes made from fermented berries and crushed insects, hastily applied over cheaper linens. These weren't just attempts at vanity. They were desperate bids to cheat the system, to sneak into the afterlife wearing colors that might fool the gods. Because in ancient Egypt, even in death, you were what you wore, and the elite made sure everyone remembered it. But if colors could brand the dead, imagine what they revealed about the living. Beyond the wrappings, beyond the tombs, an even more intricate web of symbolism awaited, one where every amulet, every inscription, every carefully chosen word formed a language of control as potent as the chemicals preserving the bodies themselves. Ramses II didn't just rule Egypt, he conquered time itself. When his mummy was unwrapped in the late 19th century, archaeologists gasped. 3,000 years after his death, his face remained eerily intact, the strong nose and high cheekbones mirroring the colossal statues he'd erected across the kingdom. This wasn't an accident, it was statecraft carved in flesh. Every perfect line of his preserved features screamed a message to both ancient and modern onlookers: true power never decays. The spectacle of royal mummification was ancient Egypt's most brilliant propaganda machine. Imagine the scene: 70 days of public processions, with priests chanting as the pharaoh's body was carried through the streets, swathed in linen that gleamed with Tyrian purple. Crowds gathered to catch whiffs of sacred resins, to glimpse the golden masks being fitted, each step a carefully staged performance of divine permanence. It was the equivalent of a modern coronation, military parade, and currency redesign rolled into one. Just as today's leaders mint their faces on coins or carve their likenesses into mountains, Ramses used his mummy as a living, well, technically dead, monument to his unstoppable reign. But the exclusion was as deliberate as the display. While pharaohs rested in gilded sarcophagi packed with imported spices, commoners faced a brutal reality. Most couldn't afford natron, let alone myrrh. Their bodies were often merely dried in salt or stuffed with reeds before being tucked into shallow graves. Some resorted to pseudo-mummification, wrapping loved ones in recycled linens smeared with cheap resin substitutes, hoping to trick the gods into granting them passage. The disparity sent a chilling message. Eternity had tears, and your place in the afterlife mirrored your status in this one. Archaeologists found proof of this inequality in the workers' graves at Deir el-Medina. These were the artisans who built the very tombs that celebrated eternal glory. Yet their own burials contained nothing but rough-hewn wooden coffins, and if they were lucky, a single copper amulet. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Ramses' mummy radiated golden perfection, while the hands that carved his sarcophagus lay in anonymous earth, the genius of this system. It made inequality feel inevitable, even sacred. A farmer toiling under the sun didn't just see a pharaoh's mummy as a display of wealth, he saw it as proof of cosmic order. The rulers weren't flaunting their privilege, they were fulfilling their divine duty, preserved as perfectly as Mat, the principle of balance itself. And if you wanted even a fraction of that eternity, you played by their rules. Modern parallels leap to mind. Think of how nations preserve founding fathers in climate-controlled archives or embalm revolutionary leaders for public display. From Lenin's glass coffin to America's meticulously restored constitution, the message is the same: control the relics and you control the narrative. But here's what sets ancient Egypt apart: they weaponized not just the body, but the very science of preservation. In a world where decay was the ultimate equalizer, they found a way to make immortality a privilege. And in doing so, they built an empire that, at least in stone and spirit, still hasn't crumbled. Yet beneath the gold and grandeur lies an uncomfortable truth. The same chemicals that preserved Ramses' face also preserved the fingerprints of the workers who applied them, oil stains from hurried hands, linen threads pulled too tight in exhaustion. Even in death, the rulers couldn't erase the people who made their eternity possible. Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all. No matter how carefully you wrap it, power always leaves traces. In the shadow of the pyramids, death had a price list. A pharaoh's mummification could cost the equivalent of a mid-sized city's annual grain supply, premium natron from Wadi Natron, liters of imported myrrh, linen woven by temple virgins, and a sarcophagus carved from Nubian gold. Meanwhile, a farmer's family might scrape together enough for a pottery shard inscribed with spells, hoping the gods wouldn't notice the lack of proper bandages. This wasn't just burial, it was capitalism in linen wrappings, where the afterlife mirrored the brutal economics of the living. Temple ledgers from Thebes reveal the stark math. For the price of one royal embalming, you could feed 500 families for a year. Middle-class officials often went into generational debt for basic preservation, trading olive orchards or fishing rights to priests in exchange for a few jars of second-grade resin. The poorest resorted to sand mummification, burying loved ones in the desert's edge, praying the climate would do what their wallets couldn't. Archaeologists find these graves heartbreakingly bare, a body curled sideways to fit a shallow pit, maybe a copper ring if the family splurged. The message was clear: eternity came with a sliding scale, and where you landed depended entirely on your last earthly balance sheet. But the real shocker: the black market that thrived around these rituals. Papyrus court records detail rampant tomb robbing not for gold, but for embalming supplies. A single jar of stolen cedar oil could fetch 6 months' wages on the backstreets of Memphis. Counterfeiters boiled pine sap with ochre to mimic frankincense, while linen merchants secretly blended flax with cheap hemp, selling it as temple grade. Even natron got cut with table salt, an ancient version of selling knockoff pharmaceuticals. The risk was immense. Getting caught meant impalement or being mummified alive as punishment. Yet the demand never wavered, proving how desperately people clung to the hope of buying their way into paradise. The priesthood weaponized this desperation. They propagated the nightmare of the second death, a horror worse than the first. Wall paintings showed poorly preserved souls stumbling through the afterlife, their crumbling bodies rejected by the gods. Priests whispered that without proper embalming, your soul would forget its own face, wandering blind and hungry for eternity. This wasn't just superstition, it was psychological warfare. When a tax collector came calling or a peasant hesitated to donate his harvest to the temple, a casual reminder about how quickly deserts and erases a man's name worked wonders. And here's the cruel irony. The elites knew their own preservation was often theatrical. X-rays of noble mummies reveal some were stuffed with mud balls wrapped in linen to simulate organs. Their bandages died only on the visible outer layers. The real artistry wasn't in the embalming, it was in the illusion, the careful curation of fear and aspiration. Because when people believe salvation has a price tag, those who set the rates hold ultimate power. This pyramid scheme of the soul left its mark. Today, as we scroll through luxury funeral packages or watch celebrities vault their DNA into space for eternal preservation, we're facing the same old sales pitch. Packaging has changed, no more natron or golden scarabs, but the game remains eerily familiar. After all, what's cryonics if not the modern equivalent of Ramses priests promising eternity for a premium? The difference is the Egyptians were honest about one thing. In the economy of immortality, the rich always get a better seat. Fear wasn't just a byproduct of ancient Egyptian embalming. It was the engine that powered the entire industry. Imagine lying on your deathbed, knowing that a single mistake in your preservation could trap your soul in eternal torment. The priesthood didn't just sell mummification, they sold salvation, and the price was absolute obedience. Wall paintings in tombs depicted the gruesome fate of the unprepared, souls with crumbling, half-preserved bodies, condemned to wander the underworld as hungry shadows. These weren't just stories, they were carefully crafted nightmares designed to make sure no one dared question the temple's authority. Payment wasn't optional, it was a matter of cosmic survival. Temple records from Karnak detail the Book of the Dead tax, where families paid priests to inscribe spells on papyrus, ensuring safe passage to the afterlife. Skip a payment, and your loved one might face the dreaded second death, their name erased from existence. The parallels to medieval indulgences are chilling. Both systems exploited the fear of divine punishment to fill their coffers. But the Egyptians took it further. They didn't just demand gold or grain, they required total societal compliance. A merchant who shortchanged the temple might find his ancestor's mummy mysteriously lost from its tomb, a silent warning to others. The curses carved into tomb walls took this psychological warfare to another level. One inscription from the tomb of a vizier reads, "Whoever disturbs this burial, the crocodile will devour him in the water, the snake will strike him on land, and the scorpion will hunt him in darkness." These weren't empty threats, they were legal documents in stone, enforceable by the gods themselves. Archaeologists have found tombs where robbers left offerings to atone for their crimes, proof that these curses work. Fear didn't just protect the dead, it policed the living, ensuring the priesthood's monopoly on eternity remained unchallenged. Yet beneath the horror stories lay a shrewd understanding of human psychology. The embalmer's greatest trick wasn't preserving bodies, it was preserving belief. By staging elaborate public rituals, they turned science into spectacle. When priests anointed a mummy with sacred oils, the scent alone triggered deep, almost primal reactions. Myrrh's earthy aroma was linked to the divine, frankincense's sweetness to celestial favor. These sensory cues bypassed logic, making the supernatural feel tangible. A farmer might not understand Natron's chemistry, but when he saw his pharaoh's perfectly preserved face 3 decades after burial, the message was undeniable: pay up or rot. Modern science reveals even darker genius in these tactics. The blue lapis lazuli in burial masks didn't just symbolize the heavens. Its shimmering particles caught the light in dim tombs, creating an eerie glow that mimicked the stars. Chants during embalming weren't just prayers. Their rhythmic vibrations matched the frequency of anxiety-inducing sounds, heightening the fear of divine wrath. Even the 70-day mummification timeline played a role, long enough for grief to soften into desperation, making families more willing to empty their coffers for guaranteed salvation. The real horror, this system still echoes today. From predatory funeral upsells to the billion-dollar afterlife promises of certain modern cults, the blueprint remains the same: weaponize fear, monetize hope, and above all, control the narrative. The ancient Egyptians didn't invent the concept of selling eternity. They just perfected it, wrapping it in linen and chemistry so potent, its power still lingers millennia later. The most luxurious embalming ingredients weren't always what they seemed. Behind the temple's gilded doors, a shadow economy thrived, one where sacred resins got watered down, where premium natron was secretly mixed with cheap salt, and where linen bandages bore counterfeit temple seals. Modern CT scans reveal the truth. Beneath the outer layers of a nobleman's mummy, you might find rags stuffed with mud or organs replaced by onion peels. Ancient Egypt's version of cutting corners for profit. Take the case of a mid-level official named Pentawaret, whose mummy was recently analyzed at Cairo University. His family paid for first-grade myrrh, but chemical testing showed his wrappings contained mostly pine resin dyed with ochre. The deception didn't stop there. His sarcophagus, advertised as cedar from Lebanon, turned out to be local sycamore with a thin veneer of the imported wood. This wasn't an isolated scam, it was systemic. Papyrus ledgers from Deir el-Medina list complaints about embalming workshops selling royal-grade natron that was 40% sand. The priesthood played both sides of this game. Publicly, they condemned counterfeiters, staging dramatic trials where offenders were mummified alive as punishment. Privately, they often supplied the very workshops peddling diluted ingredients. A cache of letters between high priests reveals coded discussions about adjusting purity levels during shortages, always ensuring the pharaoh's supplies remained untouched while lesser elites got shortchanged. The logic was brutally pragmatic. Why waste precious resins on someone who couldn't afford the real thing? But maintaining the illusion required more than just slick marketing. Embalmers developed tricks to fool even the most discerning clients. A dab of genuine myrrh at the mummy's nostrils masked the scent of inferior resins below. Gold leaf applied to a sarcophagus's visible edges hid cheaper wood beneath. Most cunning of all, they exploited the 70-day embalming process itself. Families were barred from the inner workshops, receiving only ceremonial glimpses of their loved ones, just enough to see the premium materials being used in those staged moments, never the substitutions happening behind closed doors. Modern science has torn away these ancient illusions. X-ray fluorescence scanners can now detect trace elements in mummy wrappings, exposing diluted resins by their chemical fingerprints. In one telling study, researchers analyzed 20 noble mummies from the same dynasty. Only 3 contained the promised imported ingredients. The rest were padded with everything from beeswax to fermented fruit paste. Yet their tombs bore identical inscriptions boasting of eternal preservation with the finest offerings of punt. The priesthood's genius lay in understanding that perception outweighed reality. As long as people believed in the system, it didn't matter if their grandfather's mummy was stuffed with reeds instead of linen. Fear of the second death kept complaints rare, who would risk their ancestors' eternity over a few missing spices. And so the charade continued for centuries, with each generation of priests inheriting and refining the art of sacred deception. Today, we see echoes of this ancient hustle everywhere, from knockoff designer handbags to diluted pharmaceuticals. But the Egyptian embalmers were pioneers of a darker truth. The most durable power isn't just control over life and death, but over what people believe lies beyond it. When the first X-rays penetrated the linen wrappings of Egyptian mummies in the early 20th century, archaeologists expected to confirm ancient boasts of perfect preservation. Instead, the ghostly images revealed something far more human: fraud on a pharaonic scale. Beneath the gilded masks and sacred amulets, many mummies were stuffed with mud balls, bundled reeds, even lumps of bitumen disguised as precious resins. One noblewoman's chest cavity held a carefully wrapped bundle that, when scanned, turned out to be a bird carcass, likely a last-minute substitution when the embalmers ran short of proper materials. The shock wasn't just about ancient corner cutting. It exposed an entire system built on illusion, where the appearance of eternity mattered more than the reality. These revelations read like an indictment of authoritarian power. Just as modern autocrats stage photo ops in front of stocked supermarkets that are actually empty storefronts, the ancient priesthood maintained a facade of flawless embalming while quietly diluting their sacred recipes. Temple inscriptions boasted of purer-than-pun's tears myrrh, yet radiography shows mid-ranking officials packed with cheap pine resin dyed red. Even some royal mummies weren't immune. Tutankhamun's scans revealed his famous golden mask was attached to a body hastily mummified, with missing organs and excess resin suggesting a rushed job after his unexpected death. The lesson: when power depends on projecting perfection, reality often gets wrapped in layers of deception. Modern laboratories are now unraveling these ancient cons with tools the priests could never imagine. Mass spectrometry can identify resin sources down to specific trade routes, proving whether a mummy's frankincense truly came from Somalia or was local knockoff. CT scans expose hidden bundles, like the nobleman whose heart scarab turned out to be a painted rock. But the real breakthrough came when chemists recreated the embalming recipes themselves, mixing natron with exact ratios of cedar oil and palm wine as described in temple texts. The results were startling. When followed precisely, these formulas rival modern preservation techniques. A 2,600-year-old mummy treated with authentic recipes retained skin elasticity that fooled researchers into thinking it was decades old, not millennia. This scientific detective work reveals a bittersweet truth. The shortcuts weren't always about greed. Sometimes they reflected genuine shortages. Myrrh caravans delayed by sandstorms, natron deposits exhausted by overmining, even climate shifts that altered resin quality. The priests weren't just cynical profiteers, they were keepers of a fragile system trying to meet impossible demands, yet their greatest legacy might be accidental. Those very frauds, the mud-stuffed torsos, the counterfeit dyes, created time capsules of economic pressure, letting us trace ancient trade collapses and social upheavals through the materials people used to fake their way into eternity. Now, as we sequence DNA from mummy bandages and 3D print reconstructed faces, we're not just studying preservation, we're witnessing the unraveling of history's most enduring magic trick, one where chemistry, power, and human desperation were forever entwined. And perhaps that's the ultimate revelation. The real secret of Egyptian embalming wasn't cheating death, but convincing the living that such a thing was possible. Modern laboratories have become time machines, peeling back the layers of ancient embalming with tools that would make an Egyptian priest's head spin. Gas chromatography, a technique that vaporizes samples to separate their chemical components, has uncovered secrets hidden for millennia. When scientists analyzed the wrappings of a 21st dynasty mummy, the machine detected traces of pistachio resin mixed with animal fat, an ingredient never before documented in embalming text. This wasn't just a random addition. The compound formed a natural biofilm, sealing the body like an antimicrobial shield. Suddenly, what historians dismissed as ritual nonsense revealed itself as precision biochemistry. The real breakthrough came when a team at the University of Tübingen recreated a royal embalming balm based on these findings. Using ratios lifted straight from temple wall inscriptions, they blended cedar oil, beeswax, and crushed myrrh into a paste. Lab tests showed the mixture didn't just smell divine, it slaughtered modern strains of E. coli and Staphylococcus. The ancient recipe outperformed some 20th century embalming fluids, its acidic pH and terpenes creating a hostile environment for decay. What's astonishing isn't just that it worked, but how it worked. Without microscopes or germ theory, Egyptian chemists had stumbled upon compounds that targeted specific bacteria. That dark resin pooling in a mummy's abdomen, turns out it wasn't just symbolic, it was science. This revelation flips our understanding of ancient technology. For centuries, we dismissed elaborate burial rites as superstition, assuming the real preservation came from dry desert air. Now we know better. The natron wasn't merely drying the body, it was lowering pH to halt enzyme activity. The onion juice rubbed on skin wasn't just ceremonial, its sulfur compounds acted as natural fungicides. Even the beeswax used to plug nostrils formed a physical barrier against insects. Every step served dual purposes, blending spiritual symbolism with ruthless practicality. Yet there's delicious irony here. The very priests who shrouded these recipes in mystic incantations were unknowingly practicing advanced chemistry. When they chanted over vats of resin, they weren't just summoning gods. They were creating polymer coatings that would last 3,000 years. Their magic spells included step-by-step instructions for achieving optimal viscosity in balms, disguised as divine commandments. Today's scientists are essentially decoding their lab notes, realizing too late that the ancients had mastered preservation techniques we're only now rediscovering. These findings force us to rethink the pyramid builders' legacy. We've long marveled at their engineering, the precision-cut stones, the celestial alignments, but their chemical prowess might be even more impressive. In an era before controlled experiments or peer review, they developed formulas through generations of trial and error, passing down knowledge as sacred lore. That cedar oil you brushed onto a mummy's skin, it took 50 failed batches with other woods before someone realized cedar's phenols were the key. The linen bandages weren't arbitrary. Their tight weave created a microenvironment that regulated humidity. Now, as biochemists patent new preservatives inspired by these ancient recipes, we're left with a humbling thought. The gap between primitive and advanced isn't as wide as we believe. Those linen-wrapped bodies aren't just artifacts, they're textbooks written in molecules instead of ink. And the deeper we dig into their chemistry, the clearer it becomes. The real magic was never in the gods. It was in the human ingenuity that made mortality pause its march, if only for a few thousand years. Long before Petri dishes or microscopes, the embalmers of ancient Egypt might have stumbled upon one of medicine's greatest secrets, germ-killing compounds. Recent chemical analyses of mummy wrappings reveal something astonishing. Certain resin mixtures used in embalming show potent antibacterial properties, strong enough to rival early 20th century antiseptics. Take the case of a 26th dynasty priest whose mummy was found with a reddish paste between its bandages. When modern researchers tested the substance, it contained a blend of cedar oil, bee propolis, and fermented plant extracts that, when combined, killed 90% of Staphylococcus bacteria in lab trials. That's not just preservation, that's pharmacy. The debate among historians is fierce. Some argue these effects were purely accidental, a happy byproduct of trial and error preservation techniques. After all, the Egyptians had no concept of microbes, attributing decay to vengeful spirits rather than invisible organisms. but others point to temple texts describing precise ingredient ratios that maximize purity, a term that, in context, might have signaled an intuitive understanding of infection prevention. One papyrus from Saqqara even instructs embalmers to drive out the corruption with fire and bitter resins, a process that, when recreated, produces vapors lethal to airborne bacteria. Whether by design or luck, these ancient chemists were brewing proto-antibiotics in their sacred workshops. Parallels emerge from other ancient technologies. Roman concrete, for instance, incorporated volcanic ash to create self-healing properties, a feature modern engineers only decoded in 2012. Similarly, traditional Chinese metallurgists alloyed bronze with arsenic to prevent rust, unaware they'd invented antimicrobial metal. The Egyptian embalmers fit this pattern of accidental brilliance, their rituals yielding scientific benefits they couldn't fully comprehend. Yet there's a crucial difference. Where concrete builders sought durability, the priests were manipulating life and death itself. Not all experts are convinced. Skeptics note that inconsistent recipes across mummies suggest no standardized formula, with some royal preservatives showing stronger effects than others. The antibacterial properties might simply reflect the natural qualities of Mediterranean resins rather than intentional design, but even this skepticism reveals something profound. Whether by chance or choice, these ancient practitioners created a system where the most sacred rituals, those reserved for pharaohs, just happened to use the most effective germ-fighting compounds. The elite didn't just get better preservation, they got something eerily close to ancient chemotherapy. The implications rattle our timeline of medical history. For centuries, we credited Fleming's 1928 penicillin discovery as the dawn of antibiotics. Now we're staring at linen strips from 1000 BC that halted bacterial growth just as effectively, if on a smaller scale. It forces us to ask, how much forgotten knowledge lies wrapped in those tombs? What other medical breakthroughs did ancient cultures possess without the vocabulary to articulate them? Yet for all its wonder, this discovery casts a long shadow, because the same priesthoods that guarded these recipes also weaponized them, turning public health into private power. When the next plague swept through Memphis, it wasn't the farmers who received resin-coated bandages, it was the temple accountants. This selective protection wasn't just about status, it was about control, ensuring that survival itself became a privilege of the connected. And that dark truth leads us to the most unsettling chapter of all, how embalming secrets weren't just used to cheat death, but to dominate the living. The sacred oils and resins that preserved pharaohs for eternity came with a dark, hidden cost. Many were slowly killing the priests who handled them. Modern toxicology reports on embalming workshop remains tell a grim story. Skeletal deformities consistent with chronic mercury poisoning, lung tissue scarred by caustic resin fumes, even traces of arsenic in the hair of senior embalmers. These men weren't just performing rituals, they were unwitting test subjects in history's longest-running chemical experiment. The very substances that granted immortality to the dead were stealing years from the living. Take the infamous red mercury paste found in royal tombs, a vibrant scarlet substance heralded in texts as the blood of the gods. Chemical analysis reveals it was actually cinnabar, a mercury sulfide compound so toxic that breathing its dust could cause tremors, memory loss, and organ failure. Yet temple records show embalmers worked with it daily, grinding it into powder for ceremonial anointing. The health effects must have been horrific. Accounts from the workmen's village at Deir el-Medina describe priests suffering shaking sickness and mind fog, symptoms we now recognize as acute mercury poisoning. Even their burial sites show abnormalities: clusters of arthritic skeletons buried with their embalming tools, their bones stained reddish from years of chemical exposure. The ruling class almost certainly knew. Medical papyri described treatments for resin cough and natron burns, proving they recognized these occupational hazards. But the system continued unchanged because the price was deemed worth paying. A single pharaoh's mummy required literal tons of natron, gallons of resin, and months of toxic labor, all for one perfect specimen that would awe the masses. Workers were disposable, eternity was not. Striking parallels emerge with modern industrial hazards, like 19th century radium girls painting glow in the dark watch dials or contemporary warehouse workers collapsing from heat stress. The ancient embalmers were casualties of progress. The difference: today we have OSHA and whistleblower protections. In Egypt, complaining about safety risks was tantamount to blasphemy. A worker who refused to handle cinnabar wasn't just endangering his job, he was risking accusations of sabotaging a pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. Yet the exploitation extended far beyond chemistry. The same workshops that poisoned priests also relied on brutal labor systems. Recent excavations at Saqqara uncovered mass graves of temporary workers, likely conscripted farmers who died during peak mummification seasons from chemical exposure or accidents. Their bodies received the cruelest irony, dumped in shallow pits without even the basic preservation they'd sacrificed their lives to provide for others. Temple accountants itemized these casualties coldly, one ledger noting 32 sand burials for the unworthy, their names erased to avoid bad omens. This calculated cruelty reveals the true machinery of power. Just as the elite controlled access to the afterlife through embalming, they controlled the narrative of sacrifice. Wall carvings show smiling priests anointing mummies, never the coughing, shaking men who actually did the work. The message was clear: some lives mattered enough to be preserved forever, while others existed only to make that preservation possible. Now, as modern archaeologists don hazmat suits to handle these same toxic artifacts, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The same civilization that gave us mathematical precision and architectural marvels also practiced a form of industrial sacrifice we'd recognize in any sweatshop today. The brilliance of their chemistry was matched only by the ruthlessness of its application, a duality wrapped as tightly as any mummy's bandages, preserving not just bodies but the hierarchies that made them possible. The embalming workshops reeked of salt and suffering. While priests chanted spells in gilded temples, the real work of mummification happened in dim, airless chambers where teams of slaves and laborers toiled until their hands cracked from natron burns. Recent excavations at the workers' village of Deir el-Medina paint a grim picture: crude shelters with floors stained black from spilled resins, heaps of broken pottery that once held toxic mercury pastes, and skeletal remains showing spinal deformities from hauling stone slabs heavier than their own weight. These weren't just employees, they were casualties of Egypt's death industry, their bodies breaking under the weight of eternity's demand. Tomb paintings tell a carefully curated story, serene priests in spotless linen overseeing the sacred art. But dig deeper and the truth emerges. Papyrus payroll records list payments in grain and oil, with deductions for spoiled natron or bandage errors, proof that workers faced brutal penalties for mistakes. One fragment from the reign of Ramses III details the punishment of an embalmer named Kossa. After a noblewoman's mummy showed signs of decay, he was forced to reimburse the cost of the entire burial by working extra shifts in the turquoise mines. Worse still, the names of these laborers rarely appeared in official accounts. They were ghosts in their own system, preserving the identities of the dead while theirs vanished into the ledger books. Resistance flickered in the shadows. Archaeologists found whispers of rebellion beneath the floorboards of workshops, tiny clay figurines pierced with needles. L-I-K-E-L-Y, Chinese letter against cruel overseers. A graffito in a Theban tomb shaft reads, "The priest's tongue is honey, his whip is scorpions. Even the tools tell stories, embalming hooks deliberately bent to slow work, resin jars sealed with thin layers so contents would spoil faster." These weren't just acts of defiance, they were survival tactics in an economy that valued cedar wood over human breath. The ultimate irony lies in the workers' own burials. While they prepared pharaohs for celestial journeys, their own bodies were dumped in shallow desert pits without so much as a linen shroud. Forensic analysis shows many died before 30, their lungs clogged with resin dust or livers shriveled from chemical exposure. Yet their greatest legacy might be the fingerprints still pressed into the bandages of the mum as they wrapped unintentional signatures that refused to let history forget their hands shaped eternity too. Occasionally, the system cracked. During the labor strikes of the 20th dynasty, records show embalming workshops stood empty for months as workers demanded fair rations. One papyrus petition pleads, "We are hungry, our children cry, yet the tombs of nobles grow fat with gold." The response was typical, a mix of concessions and repression, with ringleaders reassigned to distant quarries. But the strikes proved something revolutionary. Even in a civilization built on eternal order, the living could still disrupt the machinery of death. Today, as we admire the gilded masks in museum cases, it's worth pausing before the unmarked graves at Deir el-Medina, because the real magic of mummification wasn't just chemistry or artistry. It was the illusion that immortality could be mass-produced without human cost. The workers knew better. Their bones, still whispering across millennia, remind us that behind every pharaoh's perfect preservation stood countless others who crumbled to dust unnamed. Some embalmers didn't just cut corners, they waged silent war with their tools. Archaeologists examining 19th dynasty noble mummies found shocking evidence of deliberate sabotage. Organs left to rot inside bodies despite empty canopic jars. Natron applied so thinly it barely dried the skin. Even sacred amulets placed upside down to invalidate their magic. These weren't mistakes. They were calculated acts of rebellion, hidden beneath layers of linen where only the gods would notice. The most brazen case came from a Theban tomb where a vizier's mummy had been stuffed with rags soaked in Nile mud instead of precious resins. Scans revealed the ultimate insult: someone had substituted the man's golden heart scarab with a baked clay replica painted to look authentic. This wasn't poverty cutting costs. This was someone ensuring a powerful man's soul would fail its final judgment. Temple records hint at the motive: a scratched notation about withheld wages and a worker's family left to starve. That dried mud wasn't just filler. It was revenge served cold across 3 millennia. Fear of such sabotage transformed embalming into one of history's first heavily monitored industries. Priests instituted a system of checks worthy of a nuclear facility, multiple inspectors initialing each process. Materials weighed before and after use, even dummy mummies created to test new workers' loyalty. A single misplaced amulet could land an entire team in the turquoise mines. Sound familiar? These are the same oversight tactics modern corporations use to prevent warehouse theft or factory slowdowns. The birth of workplace surveillance traces straight back to those linen-wrapped corpses. Yet the greatest irony lies in how these controls backfired. Excessive scrutiny created new vulnerabilities. At Amarna, archaeologists found a cache of worker notes detailing how they'd exploit the inspection system, applying a perfect outer layer of bandages while skipping interior treatments. or using inspection days to accidentally expose high-status mummies to moisture. The more rules the priests imposed, the more creative the circumventions became. A particularly poetic act of rebellion surfaced in Memphis, where workers substituted a tax collector's mummified tongue with a donkey's, ensuring he'd bray like an ass when questioned by Osiris. This shadow war reached its peak during the labor unrest of the 20th dynasty. Papyrus scrolls describe sick days, coinciding with key embalming deadlines and entire workshops, mistakenly swapping noblemen's identities in their tombs. The most devastating act, secretly using inferior natron on a pharaoh's son, resulting in such rapid decay that his public unwrapping became a humiliation. The punishment was brutal, mass crucifixions along the Nile, but the damage was done. Faith in the priesthood's infallibility had cracked, which brings us to the empire's unraveling. As Persian and Greek conquerors marched into Egypt, they didn't just seize gold or land, they targeted the embalming industry. But without the secret knowledge guarded by generations of workers, the new rulers' mummies turned to dust within decades. The final humiliation came when Cleopatra, last of the pharaohs, was preserved with Roman methods rather than Egyptian rites. After 3,000 years, the chain was broken not by outside force, but by the slow erosion of trust between those who gave orders and those who carried them out. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson written in those crumbling bandages. No system of control, no matter how elaborate, can survive when the hands that sustain it have no stake in its survival. The pyramids still stand, but the true monuments to eternity turned out to be those small, defiant acts. The swapped amulets, the hidden mud, the silent protests wrapped in sacred linen. Because while empires rise and fall, the human impulse to resist never mummifies. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BC didn't just topple pharaohs, it cracked open the sacred monopoly on eternity. When Cambyses II's armies marched into Memphis, they didn't merely seize gold or grain. They captured the embalming workshops, hauling priests back to Susa like living trade secrets. Suddenly, the closely guarded recipes that had sustained Egyptian power for millennia were being whispered in foreign courts. It was the ancient equivalent of a tech giant's proprietary code leaking to competitors, except instead of algorithms, the stolen knowledge could cheat death itself. Temple records from this period reveal the priesthood's panic. A desperate decree from the high priest of Ptah warns that the unworthy now touch the sacred salts, referring to Persian officials supervising natron extraction. Worse yet, captured Egyptian embalmers were forced to train outsiders, breaking the chain of oral traditions that had kept the art exclusive. The invaders weren't just conquering land, they were reverse engineering the very system that made Egypt unique. Soon, Persian nobles were being mummified in hybrid styles, their bodies packed with Egyptian natron but wrapped in Zoroastrian-style woolen shrouds. The message was clear: immortality was no longer an Egyptian franchise. Alexander the Great's invasion 2 centuries later accelerated the decline. Greek scholars, obsessed with Egyptian wisdom, paid top drachma for embalming manuals. The famous Library of Alexandria became a clearinghouse for these secrets, its scrolls detailing techniques that had been guarded for generations. One papyrus from the era complains that even the fishmongers of Rhodes now debate the proper viscosity of cedar oil. The priesthood's worst nightmare had come true. Their divine authority was being diluted into dinner party trivia. The Rosetta Stone epitomizes this erosion of control. Carved in 196 BC, it rendered sacred hieroglyphs alongside common Greek, demystifying the language of the gods. But it wasn't just writing that was being decoded, it was the entire apparatus of mystique that had propped up priestly power. Once ordinary people could compare temple inscriptions with their Greek translations, the veil lifted. The same happened with embalming. As Greek physicians like Herophilos dissected mummies and published findings, the magic was exposed as sophisticated chemistry. Modern parallels abound. Think of how tightly guarded corporate patents, from pharmaceutical formulas to silicon chip designs, shape global power today. When those secrets spread, monopolies crumble. The priesthood's plight mirrors that of a tech company watching its encryption protocols get hacked and shared on the dark web. Except in their case, the trade secret wasn't just profit, it was the perceived keys to the afterlife. Yet the greatest irony lies in what happened next. As Greek and Roman elites commissioned Egyptian-style mummification, demand skyrocketed. But without the generations of nuanced training, quality collapsed. Museums today are filled with 3rd century CE mummies, their bandages sloppy, their resins poorly mixed, testaments to a sacred art reduced to mass production. The priests had warned this would happen. Their power wasn't just in knowing the recipes, but in knowing how to wield them. Now the world was learning that lesson the hard way, one crumbling imitation mummy at a time. This knowledge spillover triggered an identity crisis. Egyptian embalmers, once revered as semi-divine, became freelance consultants for foreign elites. A worker's contract from Roman era, Thebes boasts of preserving a senator's daughter in the ancient manner, complete with a money-back guarantee against decay. The sacred had become a service industry. What the invaders never grasped, though, was the cultural context woven into every step of true Egyptian mummification, the chance time to drying cycles, the astronomical alignments of wrapping sequences. You could steal the ingredients list, but not the symphony. And so, as the last priest embalmers died without successors, something irreplaceable vanished. Not the technical know-how, but the living tradition that had made it more than just a preservation manual, a bridge between worlds. Yet echoes of this struggle persist wherever knowledge and authority collide. From patent wars to AI ethics boards, we're still fighting over who controls transformative technologies and what happens when that control slips away. The real lesson of Egypt's embalming monopoly isn't about secrecy. It's about what we lose when sacred arts become commodities, and whether some forms of power can survive being decoded. The same cedar oils and natron salts that once preserved pharaohs now whisper through modern morgues. While today's embalmers use formaldehyde instead of frankincense, the core principle remains unchanged: chemistry as a bulwark against decay. Forensic scientists recently made a startling discovery. The molecular structure of ancient Egyptian resin blends shares uncanny similarities with modern preservatives. Both attack proteins in cell walls, both create cross-links that stiffen tissues, both repel insects with volatile compounds. The difference: formaldehyde works faster, but those old resin mixtures lasted longer. A 21st century autopsy table and a Theban embalming workshop have more in common than we'd like to admit. Mummies are now teaching us how to better preserve the dead and the living. When researchers at the University of Zurich analyzed Ramses II's mummy in 2017, they isolated a novel antimicrobial peptide in the linen wrappings. This natural compound, produced by soil bacteria that thrived in the resin-rich bandages, shows promise against drug-resistant superbugs. Similarly, studies of Tutankhamun's skin cells revealed how ancient fats and beeswax created a microenvironment that slowed DNA degradation, a finding now being adapted to improve organ transplant storage. The past isn't just informing the present, it's actively reshaping our medical future, yet the shadows of power linger. Just as Egyptian priests hoarded natron deposits, modern corporations patent preservation breakthroughs. The global formaldehyde market is controlled by three chemical giants who dictate prices and access, much like temple overseers once rationed sacred resins. Cryonics firms sell eternal preservation packages starting at $200,000, while hospitals in developing nations struggle to afford basic cadaver storage. The pattern is ancient. The wealthy get better chemistry, the poor get shortcuts. Even mummy research follows this divide. 90% of studies focus on royal specimens, while commoners remains molder unexamined in museum basements. This raises uncomfortable ethical questions. Should preservation science be a guarded commodity or a public good? When a team at Harvard recreated an 18th dynasty embalming balm last year, they faced pressure to patent the formula rather than publish it openly. The argument echoed pharaonic logic. Exclusivity funds innovation, but history shows what happens when knowledge becomes too tightly held. The slow decay of expertise, the rise of counterfeit methods, the inevitable leaks that render monopolies obsolete. Perhaps the real lesson from those linen-wrapped bodies isn't about chemistry at all, but about the cost of gatekeeping progress. As we stand at the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern science, the mummies silently pose one final challenge. Will we repeat their mistakes or finally learn from them? The answer may determine whether our own legacy lasts 3,000 years or crumbles like poorly mixed natron in the desert sun. 3,000 years after Egyptian priests guarded their embalming secrets, we've swapped temple workshops for corporate boardrooms, but the game remains eerily familiar. Modern pharmaceutical giants now hold the keys to life and death, much like those ancient priests controlled the passage to eternity. When a company spikes the price of insulin by 500% overnight, or patents a life-saving drug in a way that keeps generics locked out for decades, they're playing by the same rulebook. The materials have changed: synthetic compounds instead of natron, algorithms instead of incantations, but the power dynamics, those are as old as the pyramids themselves. Take the recent scandal over a hepatitis C cure priced at $84,000 per treatment. Like the priests who rationed myrrh based on social status, executives calculated exactly how much desperate patients would pay before their livers failed. Or consider AI systems now used by some hospitals to prioritize care: black box algorithms deciding who gets a bed or a ventilator, their logic as inscrutable as any priest's divination. The parallels are unsettling. Ancient embalmers justified exclusivity by claiming divine will, while modern gatekeepers cite market forces or proprietary technology. The language updates, but the outcome stays the same. Those with access thrive, while others are left to crumble. Archaeology offers us a lens to spot these patterns. Just as tomb robbers found ways around temple monopolies, today's medical tourists cross borders for affordable treatments, and hackers leak drug formulas online. The backlash against excessive control follows a script written in hieroglyphs long ago. When Martinus H. Crelly jacked up the price of Daraprim, the public outrage mirrored ancient workers' revolts against embalming extortion. History whispers a warning: systems that commodify survival inevitably breed resistance. Yet there's a crucial difference. The Egyptians at least believed their gatekeepers answered to gods. Our modern priest CEOs, lobbyists, algorithms answer only to spreadsheets. That's what makes today's monopolies more dangerous. When a sacred resin shortage struck Memphis, priests would stage rituals to appease the populace. When a pharmaceutical CEO faces a PR crisis, they launch an access program with enough loopholes to preserve profits. The theater of benevolence has evolved, but the calculus remains: how to give just enough to pacify while keeping true control locked away. Perhaps the most telling artifact of our era isn't a mummy, but a patent application. The legal jargon about novel formulations and exclusivity periods serves the same purpose as temple inscriptions warning of curses. Both are designed to intimidate, to mystify, to keep the uninitiated from questioning why life-saving knowledge can't be shared freely. Archaeology teaches us that no monopoly lasts forever, not on natron, not on drugs, not on algorithms. But the human cost of their collapse, that's written in the bones of those who couldn't afford to wait. The linen-wrapped bodies of ancient Egypt don't just teach us about preservation, they reveal a blueprint of power that still operates today. At its core, the embalmer's art was never just about cheating decay. It was about controlling the most fundamental human fear, the terror of being forgotten. By monopolizing the science of eternity, the priesthood didn't just preserve bodies, they engineered a system where obedience was the price of immortality. And that's the first brutal lesson etched into those bandages. Secrecy is the ultimate leverage. When knowledge is concentrated in the hands of a few, it doesn't just create experts, it creates gatekeepers. Whether it's natron deposits guarded by temple soldiers or modern algorithms locked behind corporate firewalls, the principle remains unchanged. Control the tools of survival, and you control the survivors. Fear, it turns out, is the oldest currency. The Egyptians didn't just sell embalming, they sold the nightmare of what would happen without it. Tomb paintings showed souls crumbling into dust, their names erased from existence. Priests whispered about the second death, a fate worse than the first. This wasn't spirituality, it was psychological warfare, a masterclass in turning dread into profit. Fast forward to today, and the parallels are uncomfortable. From insurance policies that play on mortality, fears to subscription models that threaten digital oblivion if payments lapse, the monetization of anxiety hasn't evolved, it's just gone digital. The mummies remind us, when someone profits from your fear, question who's really pulling the strings. But perhaps the most enduring revelation is how easily science becomes sacrament. The priests didn't call natron a desiccant, they called it the tears of Horus. Resin wasn't antiseptic, it was the blood of sacred trees. By cloaking chemistry in mysticism, they made skepticism feel like heresy. Sound familiar? Modern elites wield the same playbook, dressing corporate interests in the robes of innovation or progress. When a pharmaceutical CEO defends sky-high drug prices as necessary for research, or a tech giant frames surveillance as connecting the world, they're speaking the same coded language. The lesson: whenever knowledge is presented as too complex for ordinary scrutiny, ask who benefits from that confusion. So what are the natron salts of our era? Look for the resources that grant access to what we value most today, not eternal life, but health, security, and connection. Insulin patents, encryption keys. Social media algorithms, these are the modern equivalents of guarded temple recipes, the tools that dictate who thrives and who's left behind. The difference is we're no longer dealing with priests who believed their own myths. Today's gatekeepers understand exactly what they're hoarding, and that makes their control even more deliberate. History rarely repeats, but it always rhymes. The rise and fall of Egypt's embalming monopoly mirrors every cycle where knowledge consolidates, corrupts, and eventually crumbles. The priests thought their system would last forever, but eternity has a way of outlasting even the most carefully preserved power structures. As we stand in an age of AI oligarchs and genetic patents, the mummies whisper a warning: no monopoly on survival lasts forever. The only question is how much dust we'll swallow before we demand a more equitable share of the future. The art of preservation was never just about slowing decay. It was about freezing power structures in place like resin hardening around a pharaoh's body. Every jar of natron, every drop of imported myrrh, every linen strip inscribed with spells served a dual purpose: to protect flesh from time, and to reinforce hierarchies that claim dominion over eternity itself. Modern science has peeled back those layers, revealing the fingerprints of control pressed into the very chemistry of mummification. CT scans show where noblemen's organs were carefully stored in golden canopic jars, while laborers' remains were stuffed with reeds. Mass spectrometry traces how priests diluted sacred resins for the middle class but kept the purest blends for royalty. Even the positioning of amulets followed strict codes. Gods' faces turned toward elites in death, just as their statues faced them in life. What makes these revelations thrilling isn't just uncovering ancient secrets, it's seeing how bluntly the tools of permanence were weaponized. Like forensic detectives, researchers now decode the politics in every chemical residue. A 2,400-year-old mummy's hair analysis might reveal lead poisoning from cosmetic palettes reserved for nobles, while the brittle bones of the workers who mined that lead crumble anonymously beneath the desert. The real preservation wasn't of bodies but of inequality, a system where your chance at eternity depended on your station, your wealth, your willingness to kneel. As Egyptologist Salama Ikram once observed, to study mummies is to unpack Chinese letter of tyranny. Chinese letter held more than scalpels and salts. It contained the blueprints for control that still echo today. The next time you encounter something presented as immutable truth, whether it's an algorithm dictating your opportunities or a price tag on life-saving medicine, ask whose eternity it's designed to preserve. Because the greatest lesson those linen-wrapped figures teach us isn't about how to cheat death. It's about recognizing when we're being sold someone else's forever. If peeling back these layers of history fascinates you, consider this your invitation to dig deeper. Subscribe and join us as we keep unearthing the hidden systems that shape our world, one revelation at a time. The past never really dies. It just waits, preserved in the strangest places, ready to speak when we're brave enough to listen.